So I'm one of two. My brother George, myself, he's a couple of years older. We grew up in Loughton in Essex, overlooking some fields, and I think as a young man, my memory is just running over those fields, playing football, causing havoc, trying to drown myself in the local river Roding. And yet, ironically, my brother was the perfect child, the well-behaved kid, but I was always the nuisance. But yeah, it was, you know, didn't see a lot of my dad. He enjoyed a certain lifestyle, and he used to be a footballer, and he worked for the BBC as a young man, so I never really got to see him. And he also used to spend a lot of time over at Highbury, over at Arsenal, because he was big into football. And he'd often take George, because George was the well-behaved child. But I would just, you know, I'd stay with Mum at home, or alternatively, I remember spending a lot of time in the office, because Mum had an insurance practice in Loughton in Essex. So I'd often spend a lot of my sort of young adult, young life out the back there, being looked after by all the staff and causing havoc down there as well. I always had a positive outlook on life, and I used to run around and enjoy my sport. I used to enjoy life. And I think where it changed was when Dad left. That's when my life started to drastically change. I remember, you know, one minute he was there, next minute he'd left the country, and that really had a negative impact on me, because my dad was my hero. I looked up to him. He was this footballer. Everyone knew Billy Lampshire, and then he'd gone. And obviously my identity as a young boy was in my dad, and I wanted to be like him and grow up like him. And it was at that stage that it was almost like a darkness came over me, and my outlook started to change. And instead of having this sort of joyous, happy outlook on life, I started to get some very dark thoughts, and I started to hate people. I started to blame myself. I remember blaming myself for Dad leaving. And whilst I sort of became a very lively character on the outside, I was quite dark and quiet on the inside. It was a sort of strange sort of oxymoron that was going on, a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde type character. At school, I didn't do particularly well. I wasn't particularly interested at school. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't interested academically. I did excel at sport. I enjoyed my football, my rugby, and my running. And I suppose in a way, school was like an outlet for me. It was a place, in a way, it was a place of security for me, and it's also pretty much where I suppose I found my identity. I was hanging around the wrong crowd quite a lot, got myself involved in some trouble at school. I remember coming towards the end of my school time at Buckershill Boys, and I knew I hadn't done well academically, so I thought, well, I need to apply for a job before my exam results come out. So I remember as a young 16-year-old, I went up to London and I applied for a job in the city, and I got chatting with this big shot up there. And I said to him, look, I think I can do this job for you, and you know, I've got an aptitude for, I said all sorts of things just to try and get this job, and you know, bless him, he bought it. And it transpired that I had some form of aptitude for this type of broking, this type of work that I was involved in. And so as a young 16-year-old lad, I'm now working in the City of London. I've got a good paycheck coming in. I started to get a bit more respect, I think, from some of my friends back home. So then that became my identity, that became my life, and I'm now living this sort of character lifestyle in the city that was sort of revolving around money and girls and drinking and partying, and it was fun, and I enjoyed it as a young man. Again, I had no faith at that stage. I had no belief. I was just living a life that I think a lot of youngsters wanted to live, especially when I look back at the kids who I grew up with in school, and they weren't doing the sort of thing I was doing. If you like, it looked from the outside like I made it, but the truth is I was still pretty broken inside, and I was living this sort of Jekyll and Hyde lifestyle. There was still that darkness there was still that hatred there. You know, I used to take a pleasure in hurting people as a young man. It was a very, very dark side of me that I used to try and keep under wraps. At the age of 17, I found myself in a friend's house in Epping, and they were quite keen on messing around with the occult practices, whether it's tarot or Ouija and stuff. And I remember I found myself getting involved in that one night. And what happened that evening really challenged my outlook on life, my belief of originally there not being anything out there. But then after I got involved in this, I recognised there was something. I didn't understand what it was. I thought it was harmless fun, but then I found myself getting involved in occult practices for a period of time after that. It would normally involve Ouija boards, so the practice of that sort of medium practice of contacting the dead, or so I thought. What we tried to do was just contact whoever we could contact. So we were quite inexperienced in it, but the people that we were doing it with had been, doing it for some time. I was always interested in things like the occult as a kid as well, and Egyptians and all sorts of signs. So there were and ghosts and poltergeists. I always had a fascination for these things, and I suppose this platform gave me an opportunity to start practicing those things. And I recognised pretty quickly that there was something here. And then I found myself getting more and more involved in dabbling in that form of occult practice. One night that we were messing around with the Ouija board, and we'd done it a few times before, but on this particular occasion, it got pretty bad. I thought I was trying to contact specifically, I think, my granddad again, but it just came up 666, and the glass that was on the board was just uncontrollable. It was flying all over the place, but it kept spilling out 666, and it kept pointing at me that, Joe, doomed. I was going to die. You sinned. Hell. And I couldn't understand why this thing was particularly affecting me and pointing at me and not the others that were doing this. And they were freaking out as well. And I was, trying to maintain a level of composure on the outside. But I was really shaken up because this was the first time that it was a physical attack on me. And, the things, that other manifestations, so the room went icy cold. There was something happening in the room that I couldn't put my finger on, but I knew it wasn't good. And I remember after we'd done that, and I remember we all got together, and one of my mates said, we need to say the Lord's Prayer. And I said, okay, look, whatever. You could have said, you got to quote Shakespeare's, and I would have done. I was in such a bad place. So we said the Lord's Prayer, and I got on my motorbike that night to leave, because the thing is, this also said that I was doomed, I was going to die on my motorbike, all sorts of things. So I was very fearful. And I remember I got on my motorbike from Epping, and I continued to say the Lord's Prayer. And I remember on the way home from Epping to Buckerstill, I remember saying, Jesus, if you're real, I need you, because I'm in trouble here. And I recognised that this was not good and that I needed help. I didn't know why I was calling out to Jesus, but in my mind, it was pretty obvious that if there's a negative, there's got to be a positive. And I knew that the devil was bad, and I knew Jesus must have been good. And I also remembered the Lord's Prayer from school, so I remember reciting this over and over. And I got home, and I remember running upstairs, and my mother had this big family Bible, and to this day I have no idea where she got it from. It's the one that's normally at the front of the church, on the lectern. And I remember grabbing this Bible, and I remember resting it on my chest, thinking, if anything comes at me, I'm going to hit it with the Bible. And thankfully nothing came at me that night. I mean, the Bible was heavy, that nearly killed me. And I remember putting the Bible to the side, and I kept well away from the witchcraft after that. I kept well away from that. But I'm still working in the city, and I'm still leading a hedonistic lifestyle up there. And then about 6 months passed, and it was Good Friday. And my mother had just started to go to church at St John's Buckerstill with her new husband, Stephen, my stepfather. And Mum said, do you want to come to church with me this morning? And I remember saying, Mum, I'm not interested. And I'd been drunk from the night before. I remember I woke up in the bed the wrong way round, and I'm not interested. And I said some other choice words. And then about 5 minutes passed, and I'm lying in bed. And I heard a voice very clearly say, Joe, get up and go. And I remember looking around the room thinking, what was that? Was it my own voice? I couldn't understand it. Was it something I'd taken the night before that was still... So I ignored it, totally ignored it. And then there was a second time, Joe, get up and go. And I remember I just sat up bolt right in bed, and I got changed. I said, Mum, I'm coming to church, and I think she was a little bit surprised. And I did, and I went over to St John's Buckerstill in 1992. And as I walked through the doors of this church, and I can only share what happened to me, as I walked through the doors, I just got this overwhelming feeling of love, like I was being loved by a Father I couldn't see. It was so strange. And I remember it was like somebody had lifted a veil from my eyes. Everything seemed vibrant. There was even a flower display, and even that looked vibrant. But it was just a strange feeling. It was almost like there's something going on here. I don't understand it, but I want more of it. And I got chatting, and I sat down in a breakout room, and this guy made a beeline for me and started chat with me, and he was a lovely fella. And I told him, you know, who I was and why I was sort of here. And I said, why are you here? And he said, well, I'm the vicar of the church. And I looked at him, and I was shocked because he looked normal. You know, there was no sandals or socks. There was no tambourine. There was nothing. He was just a normal guy. It transpired he was a football fan. I mean, you know, he supported Tottenham, which was an issue for me as an Arsenal fan. But we got on really well, and he started to just share some stuff with me, and then I just unloaded everything on him. I asked him all sorts of questions about spirituality and things that I'd experienced, and he sort of winced and said, you need to keep away from that sort of thing. And I didn't understand at the time, but then as time went on, I recognised the dangers of what I'd got myself involved in, and how serious that was, and how deceptive that was, and that it wasn't my granddad, and it wasn't the characters that I thought we were summoning up. It was actually demonic, it was evil, and it all made sense when I started to speak to Jonathan Bryce. And you'd probably say, well, did life get easier for you? But the truth of the matter is it didn't for me, because I'd opened up doors in my life that I should never have opened up. And it was almost like the demons wanted me back. And I went through a year and a half, I can't remember exactly how long it was, of the most horrendous nightmares, the most horrendous situations in my bedroom, in the house, that scared the life out of me, and I didn't know how to deal with it, apart from pray. And I remember I was fearful of going to sleep at nights because of another attack, and I would have nightmares. I'd wake up, you know, I'd look at the clock and it'd be 3 a.m, bang, dead on 3 a.m. There'd be a coldness in the room. Dials would spin around in my room on the heat, all sorts of crazy things. And then one night, I remember I couldn't sleep particularly well, and I went downstairs, and my stepfather was down there, and he ended up going upstairs to the bedroom, and I ended up sleeping on that couch. And in the middle of the night, I was lying there, and I was in between sleeping. And what you know, when you're in between, you're not asleep, but you're not awake, that in between. And all of a sudden, something grabbed me. The room went ice cold, and there was this high-pitched laughter. And I just remember freezing, my mouth was wide open. You know the saying, you know, frozen with fear. And I now know why they say that, it was true. And I didn't know, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even speak. And this thing was starting to drag me off the sofa. And all I could think about was praying. And in my head, I started to say, Jesus, Jesus. And then the more I started to think it, the less control this thing had over me. And I remember I managed to grabbed my quilt, I ran upstairs, and I'm upstairs, and I'm shaking. I'm shaking. It was like I was in a battle I couldn't see on the outside, but internally there was a warfare going on. And I remember I'm trying to read my Bible, and I'm shaking, and it just was strange. And I think what shocked me more than anything is, as I'm looking around the room, it was peaceful, quiet. My cousin was sleeping quietly, he was over. It was peaceful, yet inside me, it was just like a war was going on. It was bizarre, and I remember waking up my stepfather and just telling him what had happened, and I just broke down. I was so scared. That led me on a journey of spending a lot of time with the rector of the church, and he said, look, you need deliverance. you've exposed yourself to far too much stuff over the years, and you need supernatural help. You need God to help you to get you out of this. And he was right. And then a few months later, I was at a Christian conference, and I ended up going through a whole deliverance process. I mean, literally, swearing, spitting, cursing. The only thing that didn't happen was my head didn't spin round. But it was a situation where I was totally out of control. But God in his mercy met me through this guy. This guy started to pray over me. And after this deliverance process, it transpired that the guy that was praying for me worked in the city, and he didn't just work in the city, he worked in the same job that I was doing, and he worked over the road to me. And bearing in mind, this is, this deliverance and this place was down in Skegness and all those miles away, and yet this guy was there for me. And we ended up meeting up after work and during lunch times, and it was then I really started to develop my faith. It was really then that I took, dare I say, God seriously, and my life started to change. And after that, there was a lot of peace, and that's when the peace really came. I had peace when I asked Jesus into my life, but there was always this issue that needed addressing. And now and again it would manifest itself, but not really. But then when it did, and then when it left, and that's when I really had peace. But when you've gone through a deliverance process, when you've gone through the darkness that I went through, and your only hope is God, and you're calling out to him to look after you and for this crazy stuff to stop. And then when you get the deliverance and you recognize it was all because of Jesus, to me, he meant everything. And I think what it did for me is it made me draw close to him every time that there was trouble in my life, any time that there was pain in my life. I've always drawn near to him. Like when Mum died, I just got very close to Jesus because I run to him, in all circumstances. Now I just find the comfort in him. He's real, and he was there for me in my darkest time. And the Bible says, who the Son sets free is free indeed. So I would say, look at the accounts of Jesus. Ask him into your life. If you don't believe, there's plenty of historical evidence for him. He's not a myth. He's not a pagan deity. He's real. He's the Son of God, and he wants to continue to change lives. And he changed my life, and he can change it for you too.